Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this episode, we follow a quiet but heartfelt plan that unfolds behind the scenes. When Diep and little Nhi secretly prepare a birthday surprise for James, what starts as an ordinary day slowly transforms into an emotional evening filled with laughter, unexpected guests, and moments James never knew he was missing. With the presence of Lee and two Sam, the celebration becomes more than just a birthday party. It turns into a gentle reminder of connection, gratitude, and being remembered. Stay until the end to feel how one simple surprise can soften even the most guarded heart. And don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support truly means the world to us. The early morning chill wrapped itself around the small house, slipping quietly through half-open windows and settling into every corner. Outside, the sky was still pale, hovering between night and dawn, while inside, Diep was already awake. She lay still for a few seconds, listening carefully. James's steady breathing from the other room, the faint rustle of leaves outside, the soft ticking of the wall clock. Everything was calm, perfect. Today was not an ordinary day. Diep slowly sat up, careful not to disturb anyone. She moved like a shadow, slipping on a light sweater before stepping out of the bedroom. Her heart was already beating a little faster than usual, a mix of excitement and nervous energy. Today was James's birthday, and for the first time in a long while, she wanted it to feel special, warm, surprising, unforgettable. She stepped into the living room, where everything still looked normal. Too normal. If James walked out right now, he wouldn't suspect a thing. That was exactly how it had to be. A soft sound came from the small bedroom nearby. Diep turned just in time to see little Nhi sitting up on the bed, her hair sticking up in every direction, eyes half open with sleep. Diep immediately walked over and knelt beside her. "Hey," she whispered gently, brushing Nhi's hair back. "Good morning." Nhi blinked a few times, then suddenly remembered. Her eyes widened. "Auntie Diep," she whispered excitedly. "Today is Uncle James's birthday, right?" Diep smiled and nodded. "Yes, but remember, this is a secret." Nhi quickly covered her mouth with both hands, nodding so hard her head bobbed up and down. "I won't say anything, I promise." Diep couldn't help laughing softly. She loved moments like this. Small, quiet conspiracies that made ordinary days feel magical. They tiptoed into the kitchen together. Diep began preparing breakfast, choosing simple dishes on purpose, nothing fancy, nothing that might raise suspicion. As she cracked eggs and heated water, she kept glancing toward the hallway, listening for footsteps. "Uncle James is always busy," Nhi whispered, sitting on a chair and swinging her legs. "Will he have time to celebrate?" Diep paused for a moment, then answered honestly, "That's why we're doing this. Even if he's busy, we want him to feel remembered." Nhi nodded seriously, as if she understood far more than her age suggested. By the time the food was ready, the sun had risen higher, filling the house with soft golden light. Diep arranged the bowls neatly, wiped the table one last time, and then gently knocked on James's door. "James," she called casually, keeping her tone normal. "Breakfast is ready." A few moments later, the door opened. James stepped out, looking slightly disheveled, his tie already draped over his arm, phone in hand. "Morning," he said, rubbing his eyes. Morning, Diep replied with a calm smile, as if today was just another day. Nhi ran over immediately. Uncle James, come eat with me. James chuckled and sat down beside her. You're up early. Nhi grinned. I had important plans today. Diep shot her a quick look, and Nhi instantly focused on her food, pretending nothing had happened. Breakfast passed quietly, filled with small, familiar conversations. James talked about meetings, about deadlines, about calls he had to return. Diep listened, nodding, though her mind was already racing ahead, thinking about decorations, timing, guests. She watched James closely. The lines of fatigue around his eyes were more noticeable lately. Even now, sitting at the table, he looked like he was already half at work. After finishing, James stood up and grabbed his jacket. I might be late tonight, he said. There's a lot going on. Diep's heart skipped slightly, but she kept her expression steady. Just try to come home for dinner. James smiled faintly. I'll try. Once the door closed behind him, the house fell into silence for exactly 3 seconds. Then Nhi jumped off her chair. He's gone, Diep laughed, finally letting her excitement show. Okay, Operation Surprise officially begins. She pulled a storage box out from under the bed. Inside were colorful balloons, ribbons, tape, and a carefully folded banner she had prepared days ago. Nhi clapped her hands when she saw everything. Can I help? Nhi asked eagerly. Of course, Diep replied. You're my assistant today. They worked together quietly but joyfully. Nhi helped blow up balloons, though several escaped her hands and bounced across the room, making her burst into giggles. Diep taped ribbons along the walls, occasionally stepping back to check if everything looked balanced. Uncle James likes blue, Nhi reminded her seriously. I know, Diep said, reaching for another blue balloon. By mid-morning, the living room had been transformed, but everything was carefully hidden. Curtains were drawn, decorations folded behind screens, lights kept off. To anyone else, the house still looked ordinary. Next came the cake. Diep checked her phone, feeling a rush of relief when she saw the message confirming it was ready. She left Nhi at home with strict instructions and hurried out, returning an hour later with a carefully boxed cake. She opened it just enough to peek inside. White frosting, soft blue decorations, simple words written neatly on top. Happy birthday, James. Diep closed the box and placed it gently into the fridge, her hands lingering on the door handle for a moment. She felt a strange mix of happiness and nervousness. Would James like it? Would he feel awkward or touched? By early afternoon, messages began to arrive. Lee confirmed he would come straight after work. Sam promised to bring snacks and jokes, as he put it. Diep read each message carefully, replying quickly, making sure everyone understood the most important rule: absolute secrecy. As evening approached, the air in the house felt different. Anticipation hung thick, almost buzzing. Diep helped Nhi change into a clean outfit, carefully fixing her hair. You look very pretty, Diep said softly. Nhi smiled shyly. Uncle James will be surprised. At exactly 6 o'clock, a knock came at the door. Diep froze for a split second before moving quickly. She peeked through the window and immediately relaxed. Lee stood outside, calm and composed as always. Behind him, Sam waved excitedly, clearly struggling to stay quiet. Diep opened the door just enough to let them in. Shh, she whispered urgently. He'll be home soon. Sam zipped his mouth dramatically, then whispered anyway. This is exciting. Lee glanced around the room, impressed. You planned all of this? Diep nodded. With help. Nhi stepped forward proudly. They quickly set everything into place. Food arranged, chairs moved, lights prepared. Everyone found a hiding spot. Then Diep's phone vibrated. On my way home. Her heart began to pound. Okay, she whispered. Lights off. Everyone hide. They moved fast. The house fell into darkness, broken only by the faint glow from the kitchen. Nhi grabbed Diep's hand tightly. Footsteps sounded outside. Keys jingled. The door opened. Diep? James called, confused. Why are the lights off? He stepped inside, completely unaware of the smiles waiting in the dark. And in that suspended moment, just before laughter, before lights, before surprise, everything felt perfectly still. James stood just inside the doorway, his figure outlined by the dim yellow light spilling in from the street outside. The door clicked shut behind him, and the sound echoed louder than it should have in the unusually quiet house. He paused, shifting the weight of his bag on his shoulder, his instincts immediately telling him that something wasn't right. Diep? He called out again, his voice calm but edged with confusion. Why is it so dark in here? No answer. He frowned slightly, reaching into his pocket and pulling out his phone, ready to turn on the flashlight. Before he could tap the screen, a faint sound reached his ears. A muffled giggle, quickly stifled. James froze. He took a careful step forward, then another. The living room looked familiar, yet strange, as if it had been rearranged in the dark. His heart began to beat a little faster, not from fear, but from uncertainty. Did the power go out? He muttered to himself. And then, surprise! Happy birthday, James. The light snapped on in an instant. James flinched, squinting as brightness flooded his vision. For a split second, all he saw were colors, blue and white balloons floating above him, ribbons hanging from the walls. A large banner stretched proudly across the room. The silence shattered into laughter, clapping, and excited voices. Before his mind could fully process what was happening, a small body crashed into his legs. Happy birthday, Uncle James! Nhi shouted, hugging him tightly. James instinctively reached down, steadying her, his expression completely stunned. His eyes lifted slowly, scanning the room. Diep stood a few steps away, hands clasped nervously in front of her, smiling with a mix of excitement and relief. Lee stood beside her, calm and composed, a rare grin on his face. Sam was already laughing loudly, phone held up, recording everything. James let out a soft, disbelieving laugh. What is all this? Diep took a step forward. It's your birthday, she said gently. We wanted to do something for you. For me? James repeated quietly. He set his bag down slowly, as if afraid any sudden movement might break the moment. He looked around again, noticing details he'd missed before. The carefully arranged chairs, the table covered with food, the cake sitting proudly in the center, candles already lit. I didn't even remember today, he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. That's okay, Diep replied softly. That's why we remembered. Nhi tugged on his sleeve, forcing him to look down at her. Auntie Diep and I did it secretly. We didn't tell anyone. James crouched slightly so he was at her level. You planned all this? Nhi nodded enthusiastically. I helped with the balloons. James laughed. A real, unguarded laugh that surprised even himself. Then thank you, my little assistant. Lee cleared his throat lightly. You've done a lot for all of us, James. Tonight, you don't have to think about anything else. Sam chimed in immediately. Exactly. No meetings, no calls, no escaping. James raised both hands in mock surrender. All right, I'm here. Diep guided him toward the table. As he sat down, his gaze lingered on the cake. The words written on top seemed simple, but they hit harder than he expected. Happy birthday, James. The candles flickered gently, casting warm shadows across the room. Make a wish, Nhi exclaimed, bouncing on her toes. James hesitated. He stared at the candles for a long moment. Birthdays had become something he acknowledged with a brief nod, maybe a message or two on his phone. Wishes felt like something from another lifetime. But tonight, with everyone watching him, people who had taken the time to plan, to care, he closed his eyes. In that brief silence, memories rushed in. Late nights alone, missed meals, forgotten dates, the constant pressure to be responsible, to be strong, to keep moving forward without stopping. And then quietly, another feeling surfaced. Gratitude. He wished not for more success, but for more moments like this. Moments where he didn't feel alone. He opened his eyes and blew out the candles. The room erupted in cheers. Nhi clapped wildly. Sam whistled loudly. Lee nodded with quiet approval. Diep let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. As the cake was cut and plates were passed around, the atmosphere relaxed into something warm and lively. Sam wasted no time launching into stories from the past, each one more exaggerated than the last. Do you remember when James tried to handle everything by himself and ended up sleeping in his office for 3 days straight? Sam laughed. James groaned. That was not my proudest moment. Lee added calmly, You refused help, as usual. Everyone laughed, including James. He leaned back in his chair, feeling lighter than he had in a long time. Nhi sat beside him, carefully eating her cake. She kept glancing up at him, as if checking whether he was really enjoying himself. Uncle James? She asked seriously. Do you like your birthday? James smiled and wiped a bit of frosting from her cheek. I do. Very much. Even more than your work? She pressed. James paused, considering the question. Then he nodded. Yes. More than work. Nhi smiled proudly, clearly satisfied. As the night went on, conversations grew quieter, deeper. Sam leaned against the wall, arms crossed, studying James. You know, he said, his tone softer now. You don't always have to carry every in alone. James looked at him, then nodded slowly. I'm starting to understand that. Lee checked his watch and stood up. I should head out, early morning tomorrow. Sam followed soon after, breaking the mood with a dramatic yawn. All right, birthday boy. Remember tonight? Don't let work erase it. After they left, the house grew quiet again, but not empty. Diep began clearing plates, and James automatically joined her, stacking dishes without being asked. It felt natural, comfortable, like something he should have been doing all along. Nhi started yawning, her eyelids heavy. James noticed immediately and lifted her into his arms. "Sleepy?" he asked softly. She nodded, resting her head against his shoulder. "Today was fun." "Yes," James said quietly. "It really was." He carried her to bed, tucked her in carefully, and watched her fall asleep. Her breathing slowed, peaceful and steady. When he returned to the living room, Diep stood near the window, gazing out at the quiet street. "You didn't have to do all this," James said softly, stopping beside her. "I know," Diep replied, "but I wanted you to feel appreciated." James nodded, looking around the room one last time. "I didn't realize how much I needed this." They stood there in silence, the decorations still glowing softly around them.